everyone, my name is Chrissy and I'm the Director of Education, Outreach and Diversity for the Center for Genetically Encoded Materials, or CGEM. And we're one of many NSF Centers for Chemical Innovation that are funded across the country. These Centers for Chemical Innovation are multi-institutional sort of collaborative research centers that work together towards a common goal. For us, that is repurposing biology's natural protein synthesis machine, or the ribosome. So we're trying to use it to make sort of unnatural and novel polymers. That's the goal of our center. But I'm here to talk a little bit more about some of the education research that I'm doing in CGEM, focusing on sense of belonging and trying to understand whether mentorship in the context of a research environment can help shape sense of belonging, and sort of what are the ramifications of this and how we can maybe use a new understanding of this relationship to improve mentoring in general. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about representation in science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM. I want to start off by showing some data from the Pew Research Center. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see some data about ethnic and racial representation in the science fields. So you can see overall the pattern that I want to show is that the majority of folks who make up STEM careers or STEM jobs or the workforce in STEM are white. On the right-hand side, I'm showing data from chemistry, mainly because CGEM is a primarily chemistry center. And one of the things that I find really interesting about these data on the right-hand side of the slide is that it shows the number of PhDs awarded to women and men from 2010 to 2018. So the pattern I want to show is that the sort of percentage of women being awarded chemistry PhDs has not really changed, so it remains around 38%. Even though the number of chemistry PhDs awarded in general has increased by 15% within the same time span. So even though there are more PhDs sort of going through chemistry programs, we haven't really made a change in the percentage of women and men that are being awarded degrees. So I'm sure you all know, or have at least heard in the media, that representation in science, particularly of women and other marginalized groups, is a huge topic right now. The problem is that a lot of diversity efforts aren't really working. We still have this problem. It's still a topic of concern for a lot of folks. And so I want to ground this talk by just dedicating a little bit of time to understanding why some of these efforts may not be actually increasing diversity in various workplaces. So I want to start off by mentioning that diversity is not inclusion, even though these two words can be conflated in a variety of contexts. So I want to give an example. So there's been national efforts, as I mentioned, to sort of assess what the diversity is in various communities. And the overall conclusion a lot of communities and organizations have found is that there's just a lack of ethnic, racial minorities, for example, or folks who are not what we picture a scientist looking like. And so a lot of folks jump to the conclusion of like, oh my gosh, okay, we have to hire, recruit more diverse individuals. So first of all, I want to highlight that one of the problems with this statement in and of itself is that diversity is not a property of an individual, it's a property of groups. The second problem with this statement is that a lot of folks don't leave STEM just because they don't like it. I mean, they might not like it, but it's mainly because there's sort of a cultural issue that makes them feel unwelcome. And so things like bias, microaggressions, lack of representation at the mentorship level, or like, you know, at the boss level of whoever this person is, whatever level they're at, can lead individuals to feel unwelcome and like they don't actually belong in the spaces that they've been hired into or brought into. And so not getting rid of this sort of cultural or climate issue within the community can only just continue to marginalize individuals who come from different backgrounds. So instead, the solution we should all be aiming for is to make the institution and STEM spaces more welcoming and inclusive in general. So another example of this is top-down change. This is a very general term for what I'm about to explain, but the goal I want to convey is why some interventions might not work if they're done sort of top-down. So an example of this would be administrators at a university saying, our diversity intervention was not successful. And so they might feel a little bit sad, like, why is the diversity of our student body not increasing, et cetera. But the problem is that in thinking of this intervention, administrators may not have considered the needs of either their students, or if it's, administrators in a graduate program, they might not have considered the needs of their trainees, or in general, other community members. And so not taking into account the needs and thoughts and perspectives of marginalized folks within that community inherently excludes them from sort of benefiting from the particular intervention that they tried to implement. And so a solution for this is to include all stakeholders in a community in intervention design, whether that's giving them a seat at the table or surveying them or having conversations with them, being like, hey, we have the money to do XYZ. What do you think? Would that be helpful for you? And would that make you feel included and like you're, somebody that's contributing to this community and that's valued by us, which is something that not a lot of folks really think about or do when they are coming up with interventions to design. And so I bring up these sort of issues in implementing diversity efforts because this is what grounds a lot of my work. So it's throughout my PhD, I really focused on how to incorporate the voices of people who are historically excluded from making decisions, and trying to think about how to tailor interventions to a particular community based on their needs, and using that to inform changes to inclusion. So my research questions when I was a PhD student started off with whether we can identify aspects of academic culture and a climate within a chemistry department that correlate either positively or negatively with graduate student well-being, with inclusion, and with sense of belonging. So I did find that sense of belonging plays a huge key role in sort of shaping academic culture and climate. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that sort of aspect of my work, I've put the citation of one of the papers that I published just to show how we sort of use data to drive top-down initiatives and to make sure that administrators knew the concerns of the people that are usually excluded from decision-making. And from that work, because I did find that sense of belonging plays a key role in shaping how students feel in their environment, I started thinking about sense of belonging on its own and asked what are the prominent factors that contribute to sense of belonging among graduate students, postdocs, and faculty. Before I continue, I want to break down what sense of belonging is and what some of the sort of key aspects of it based on what we know from existing research. So sense of belonging is an aspect of academic membership that's linked to identity rather than to intellect. It is known as a major predictor of retention among women and peers in STEM. So again, this idea of if you don't feel like you belong in a community, regardless of why, you are more likely to want to leave that community because of constantly having to prove yourself or feeling like you do actually belong when it's maybe not inherent to your personal identity. So also sense of belonging affects academic self-efficacy, motivation, engagement, and achievement. It's sort of this feeling of social connectedness with peers and colleagues. It's a feeling of being accepted and included. It is also the feeling that your presence and contributions to a community, whether that's academic or not, are valued. And then feeling involved in a community and or a department. So it could be like your PhD program or your undergraduate program, et cetera. Until basically some of my work and a couple of years before that, sense of belonging was not really well understood on a large scale among graduate students, postdocs, or faculty. It was mostly studied in K through 12 students and undergraduate students. And so this is an image on the left-hand side of some of my work in grad school, trying to assess whether productivity and feeling like a valued member of this department is something that affects graduate student, postdoc, and faculty sense of belonging. And again, the reference for that, if you want to check it out, is on the bottom left. So I mentioned that this hasn't really been studied as a concept in graduate students, postdocs, and faculty. And one of the reasons this matters to me is because graduate culture is super unique. So things that might affect sense of belonging among undergraduates won't necessarily affect sense of belonging among graduate students. And some of the things that are different about graduate students and the PhD life in general is that you're expected to problem solve pretty independently. Having study groups is great, but ultimately you're responsible for the direction of your own research project, and your dissertation sort of depends on you being a novel researcher and contributing new things to the field. So as grad students, you're also expected to teach. Some undergraduate students teach, but the level of independence in that sort of endeavor is much greater as a graduate student. Graduate students are also in this sort of academic realm where grades don't matter quite as much as sort of progress in your research project. And so the measures of success are pretty unclear and can vary greatly. Additionally, social connectedness comes from a person's research group in graduate school, not necessarily from like living in a dorm or from being in a large class. And then also, as a graduate student, you tend to depend on 1 or 2 faculty members to graduate and not like an entire slew of courses and grades and all of that. So because of this, because of the fact that the culture is so unique, I was really interested in trying to figure out what the prominent factors are that contribute to sense of belonging among graduate students, postdocs, and faculty. And this QR code on the bottom right links to my paper if you want to read more in detail about any of the stuff that I bring up. But I'm going to highlight some of the key themes that came out of this data. So for graduate students and postdocs, they typically find it easier to talk about their science within their own research group instead of talking to other research groups or other students that are not in their group. Grad students and postdocs tend to not feel valued by their advisors all the time. They don't always feel confident or independent. Those who identify as underrepresented feel less sense of belonging in general. And those who are in year 6+ or postdocs feel less sense of belonging. So the older you go, the less likely you are to feel a sense of belonging. For faculty, faculty don't usually talk to other faculty about their research, so that kind of mirrors this other finding for graduate students and postdocs. Faculty sometimes feel valued by their department, so that sense of value is also critical. They tend to also feel inadequate compared to their peers, and this is really interesting. They believe they are good mentors, but acknowledge that they are not good mentors to every single one of their students, or all in capital and bold. And then have the highest sense of belonging of any other group in a graduate community, which makes sense. Faculty have been there the longest, they've succeeded in their field for quite a while, and it makes sense that they have higher sense of belonging than graduate students or postdocs. And then in general, everyone frequently feels like an imposter. Everyone has trouble feeling happy and accepted, and everyone feels less productive and scientifically successful than their peers. So I know this is a lot of data, but I was particularly interested in sort of the feelings of imposter phenomenon that come across. So like this feeling of being inadequate or feeling less productive and comparing yourself to your peers. And also the fact that faculty believe they're good mentors, but not to all of their students. So based on these things, the fact that imposter phenomenon negatively impacts sense of belonging, plus faculty and potentially other folks' inability to be a good mentor to all students, and the fact that that was a negative contributor to sense of belonging, says to me that satisfactory mentoring is important for sense of belonging and for sort of thinking through like, are you worthy? Do you know enough? Can you teach other people, etc.? So all of those themes seem to come across to me, which led me to come up with a couple of new research questions. So I'm interested in knowing whether there are aspects of the mentoring experience that correlate positively and negatively with sense of belonging, and whether we can use those data to somehow sort of show the importance of mentoring and incentivize better mentoring interactions and more sort of culturally relevant or inclusive mentoring interactions. So to do this research, I'm doing surveys based on an instrument that I developed in graduate school, and I'll show you some of the questions as I go through this talk. And then I'm also interviewing folks, so graduate students and postdocs who have mentored either another graduate student or an undergraduate student throughout the course of a research project within the past year. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the survey. So this is a visual narrative which conveys naturally occurring body language and social interactions to support emotive and contextual comprehension. So this is basically an image is more effective at conveying a concept or a feeling or an emotion than text. And so because of this, I chose to use images or cartoons throughout my survey. And they cover these themes. So mentoring, academic support from peers and mentors, teaching, social connectedness, and self-perceptions of success. And because this is a survey that I developed as an undergraduate, or sorry, as a graduate student, and I validated the survey as a graduate student, and basically using the survey that measures sense of belonging to see if there's any correlations between sense of belonging and those who mentor and those who don't mentor. So just to give you a sense of some of these questions. So for the mentoring theme, some of the cartoons that I've come up with are somebody, sitting or standing next to their desk thinking that they are ready to mentor a younger student. And then somebody saying, I have a question about mentoring. I'm going to ask my research advisor for advice because they are always helpful. For an example of the teaching questions, so one of these cartoons is my peers get more opportunities to mentor younger students than I do, and somebody feeling kind of sad about that while they watch their friends kind of talking and chatting and being happy. And then I'm so glad that teaching and mentoring are valued in my group. And this person is really excited, standing next to their desk again, just feeling very positive. For the self-perceptions of success theme, two of the questions are, I feel that my peers see me as a serious scholar, somebody feeling quite good about that, and then somebody feeling sad, thinking that their peers are more productive and scientifically successful than they are. So the goal of all of these was basically ask folks to relate to these cartoons, some of them only related to sense of belonging, but others related to mentoring, and seeing if there's any correlation in those two principles. So as I mentioned, the prompt for each of these cartoons is the same. So folks taking the survey will see this cartoon, and then the prompt says, please indicate to what extent each of the following cartoons relates with your current experience in the Department of Chemistry. And the options go from always relate to do not relate at all. So it's a 5-point scale. And then I'm sure you've noticed as I went through them, but some of these are positively worded. So somebody feeling excited about the situation, and some of them are negatively worded. So somebody feeling quite down or sad about a particular situation. The examples are on the slide. So the reason the scale is important is because since some of the cartoons are positively worded and some of them are negatively worded, I basically have to reverse code the negatively worded ones so that all of them fall onto this sort of overall construct. And that construct is specifically about sense of belonging and goes from not feeling belonging at all for a particular question to feeling a high sense of belonging relating to a particular question. And this is important because this overall construct sort of brings together all of the questions in the survey and ties them together to this overall theme of measuring sense of belonging. And this is an analysis method that's called item response theory that I use, which relates all of the questions on a survey back to this overall construct of sense of belonging. So another cool thing about item response theory, other than relating everything back to this central construct, is that it's based on a probabilistic model. So respondent performance on the survey is not just a function of their own sense of belonging, but it also takes into account how difficult an item is. So in this case, how hard each item is to relate with. And this is based on the probability of the entire distribution of people who take the survey. So what comes out of this sort of probabilistic model is basically an ordering of items based on how hard or easy they are for that particular community. So this is just based on who takes the survey, their sense of belonging, and based on that, how hard each item is to relate with. So I want you to keep this sort of sense of belonging construct in mind, because that is what this arrow is right now. So this is measuring sense of belonging based on the outcomes of item response theory. So what I'm going to show you is how each of the items on my survey fell in relation to this sense of belonging construct. And as we go up the arrow, the things that the community sort of rated as the most difficult to relate with will be closer to the top of the arrow, and the opposite towards the bottom of the arrow. So we'll start off with one of the easiest things to relate with, which is down here. was folks saying that asking their lab mates for advice about mentoring because they're always helpful was a pretty easy thing to do. In contrast, asking their research advisor for advice about mentoring because they're always helpful was something that they found really difficult to relate with. So this kind of shows this dichotomy between people being comfortable asking their lab mates for advice about mentoring, but not their research advisor. So next easiest for people to relate with was feeling happy and accepted, which is awesome. Then feeling like an essential member of their research group. Getting equal opportunities to mentor younger students as their peers was something that was still fairly easy to relate with, but getting more difficult. Being seen as a serious scholar by peers. Then feeling that your contributions to a research group are valued. Becomes more difficult to say that you agree with being a good mentor. Even more difficult to agree with the fact that teaching and mentoring are valued in their research group. Then being an independent, confident scientist was even more difficult to relate with. Being ready to mentor a young student was difficult to relate with. Having clear direction and knowing what to do in lab just as much as peers do is also difficult to relate with. And then the two most difficult things, I'll just click them side by side, are feeling adequate compared to peers and being as productive and scientifically successful as their peers. So you can see that some of the most difficult things to relate with are pretty indicative of imposter phenomenon. So not feeling as good as people around you in the same sort of PhD program or community, having clear direction of what to do in lab, and talking to a research advisor about mentoring. That seems to not be quite as helpful. And so interestingly, I took all of these results and sort of correlated whether those who have mentored feel more positively about certain aspects of sense of belonging. And it turns out that they do. So respondents who have mentored younger students tend to feel a greater sense of belonging than those who have not mentored. And that's a statistically significant result. So I found that this was interesting because this instrument can reliably measure sense of belonging. And now that I'm comparing mentors to non-mentors, I'm finding a significant difference. So this kind of made me change my question a little bit or add to it. Specifically thinking through whether mentoring helps those sort of feelings of imposter phenomenon. So feeling adequate and feeling like an independent, confident scientist that's productive and equally successful as peers. And then I was also curious about whether mentoring impacts self-perceptions of success. So like intelligence, productivity, independence, competence, etc. And so this is what I'm sort of taking with me into the next step of my research to do interviews. So I have some preliminary results that I will show you based on these types of questions through interviewing graduate students and postdocs within CGEM, or my center. Okay, so I did ask a lot of different questions, but given the sort of things that I found in the survey and things I want to highlight based off of my research questions, I'm just going to talk about whether mentoring helps with imposter phenomenon and whether it actually helps impact sort of these self-perceptions of success. So one thing I found that addresses both of these questions is that mentoring improves confidence. It helps with folks' sense of accomplishment, sense of value, their communication, patience, their approaches to problem solving, and their overall enthusiasm for research. And of the graduate students and postdocs that I interviewed to answer this question, the majority of them said that mentoring does improve their confidence and particularly their enthusiasm for research, because mentoring a younger student can sort of bring a lot of that love for research and excitement for lab work to come back into their lives, which I thought was pretty cool. So teaching and learning by teaching was also reported to help with those feelings of being an imposter. The interviewees also reported that helping their mentees overcome failure helps them accept their own failure and feel less like an imposter. And then in addition to that, 3 of the 7 respondents differentiated imposter phenomenon from feeling belonging within their research group. So they sort of said that they feel like an imposter within the field more so than within their research group, which I thought was also very interesting. And then lastly, teaching and mentoring was reported to help mentors grow as researchers and gain more lab responsibilities. So a lot of the respondents or the interviewees associated belonging to their research group and what everybody is working on, the more that they taught and mentored. They also said that mentoring helps mentors understand new perspectives and learn different learning styles and how to communicate with their mentee and teach them. And then mentoring also helps them feel that they are contributing to their group in a way that's appreciated and valued by not just their advisor, but by the entire community of people doing research in that group. And so this is all really interesting, and it seems to indicate that the process of teaching and mentoring helps folks not only understand their own research better and help teach, but it also helps them sort of gain more confidence and ability to carry out a lot of basic sort of research, not themes, but just accomplishing things that people associate with research, which is very exciting. All right, so for next steps, I'm going to continue doing interviews and analyzing data to understand the relationship between mentoring and sense of belonging, and then hopefully use these data to incentivize and improve mentoring interactions. And I did mention that CGEM is a pretty collaborative multi-institutional center. So we are located mostly at Berkeley, that's where my office is, but we have researchers at Stanford, Yale, Cornell, Boston College, and St. Jude's Research Hospital. And so piloting any sort of interventions about mentoring will be pretty ideal through CGEM, just because we have a pretty broad community to test things out with. And to leave you with some discussion questions, because I know I'm not in the discussion right now, but if you all want to talk amongst yourselves after this, some of the discussion questions that I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on are whether any of these results are surprising, or maybe are in line with or contradict with anything you've heard about mentoring or sense of belonging. Whether these data help understand the influence of mentoring on the mentor instead of the mentee. How could these data help incentivize mentoring, or how can they help teach mentors about the importance of sense of belonging and whether anything is missing? What specific mentoring practices might help improve mentor sense of belonging? So is there something that we could actually teach them that would help very quickly and rapidly improve mentoring, in addition to improving mentoring over time? And then what other questions might be useful to ask? So if you all have time and want to discuss these, please do. And then feel free to reach out to me at stachl@berkeley.edu or on Twitter at Chrissy Stachl. I'd be more than happy to chat with you about anything you either have questions on or discussed during this time. And then I want to just say thank you. So I work with Alana Shepards, who's here on the left, and Sarah Smaga. We collaboratively run CGEM. And then a lot of the work that I presented is based on my PhD work, which I did with all of these folks on the bottom of the screen. And then quickly, I run CGEM's summer undergraduate research program every summer. And so this is actually going to be 2022 will be our first in-person research program. And so I just want to leave the link here. If you know anyone that's an undergraduate studying any sort of chemistry or biology or chemical engineering, please feel free to let them know to apply. The deadline is in 2 weeks, February 11th. And it would just be wonderful to have you all spread the word. So thank you all for listening. I'm excited to hear back from you if you feel like reaching out. And if not, have a wonderful afternoon and weekend, and I will hear from you soon.